we couldn't do it anymore, so we stopped. Except I kept going. I didn't want to admit.
Rock and roll has always thrived on myth, wild nights, broken strings, and broken hearts. Few bands embodied both the glory and the chaos of that myth more than the Eagles. Behind the perfect harmonies and sun-soaked California sound was a storm of egos, addictions, and betrayals that nearly tore the band and its members apart. At the center of this whirlwind stood Joe Walsh, the guitar-slinging outlaw who lived louder, burned brighter, and nearly lost it all. Now, at 77, he finally rips open the curtain. What secrets has he been holding back all these years? Joe Walsh's story doesn't begin with the Eagles, nor does it begin in the calm confines of fame. It begins in Wichita, Kansas, where a boy with restless energy and a fractured sense of belonging found solace in 6 steel strings. From the start, Walsh was different. His wit was sharp, his humor almost disarming, but it disguised something darker, a gnawing hunger to be seen, to be heard, to matter. He moved through childhood like a live wire sparking in the night. His stepfather's military discipline clashed with his natural chaos, and Walsh quickly found rebellion, not in violence, but in volume. He would retreat to his guitar, losing himself in the vibrations, building an identity note by note. By his teenage years, he wasn't just another kid with a hobby. He was a force barreling toward destiny. College was supposed to straighten him out, to give him a path, but instead, it gave him a stage. While at Kent State, he joined a band called the James Gang. Their breakout hit, Funk, became the anthem of a restless generation, and Walsh became the unlikely rock prophet, with long hair, quick fingers, and a smirk that hinted at trouble. He wasn't just playing music, he was living a caricature of rock and roll excess, and yet there was something magnetic about it. But with that magnetism came danger. Walsh had no boundaries, no breaks. He once joked that he lived life like he had a paper route instead of a career. He meant it as humor, but it was a truth. Nothing felt permanent. Nothing seemed serious. He played like tomorrow might never come, and often he lived that way too. The James Gang gave him a platform, but Walsh was too big a character to stay confined. He struck out on his own, building a reputation not just as a guitarist, but as a wild man, reckless, fearless, and oddly lovable. He was the kind of man who could destroy a hotel room one night and sit quietly in a studio the next, laying down riffs that would shape rock history. His reputation spread far and wide, and it was only a matter of time before his path collided with a band that needed exactly what he had: raw energy, unpredictability, and the kind of edge that could take them from soft rock darlings to rock and roll legends. And that call came sooner than anyone expected. By the mid-1970s, the Eagles were already a powerhouse. With hits like Take It Easy and Best of My Love, they had carved out a sound, smooth, polished, radio-friendly. But beneath the perfection, cracks were forming. Glenn Frey and Don Henley, the band's architects, knew they needed something to shake the foundation. Someone who could push their sound from gentle California folk to hard-edged rock. Enter Joe Walsh. The Eagles had watched Walsh from a distance, impressed by his guitar work with the James Gang and his solo projects, particularly Rocky Mountain Way. He had a way of blending precision with chaos, a style that could both elevate and unravel a song. But more than that, he had an aura, an unpredictable, combustible presence that could change the trajectory of the band. When the call came, Walsh was already spiraling into the excess of rock stardom, but he recognized the opportunity. Joining the Eagles wasn't just another gig. It was a chance to etch his name into the bedrock of rock history. And so, in 1975, Joe Walsh became an Eagle. The timing couldn't have been more critical. The band was in the studio working on what would become Hotel California, an album that would define not just their careers, but an entire era. Walsh's arrival was like striking a match in a room already filled with gasoline. His guitar licks brought an edge that transformed their sound. His energy injected new life into the band, and his antics pushed them deeper into the rock and roll mythology. But it wasn't just the music that shifted. Walsh's presence altered the dynamics within the band. He was the wild card, the joker in a deck already stacked with egos. His humor disarmed tension. His recklessness distracted from simmering conflicts. But at the same time, he added fuel to the fire. The Eagles were no longer just musicians. They were becoming legends, and legends come at a cost. Hotel California was the proof. The title track, with its haunting guitar duel between Walsh and Don Felder, became a masterpiece of rock storytelling. The record shattered expectations, topping charts, winning Grammys, and embedding itself into the cultural fabric of America. But behind the success, the pressure mounted. Fame was no longer thrilling. It was suffocating. Tours turned into battlefields of exhaustion and indulgence. Drugs flowed freely, tempers flared, and Walsh's already reckless habits escalated. The call that had changed everything was also the call that had tethered him to a machine spinning faster than anyone could control. And the cracks that had started before his arrival, they were now growing into fissures. By 1977, the Eagles were at the top of the world. They weren't just a band, they were the band. Every song they released dominated the airwaves. Every ticket for their shows sold out in minutes, and their faces were plastered across magazines. On the outside, they looked invincible. On the inside, they were falling apart. For Joe Walsh, the machine was both a blessing and a curse. The fame gave him freedom, money, influence, adoration, but it also amplified his self-destruction. Nights blurred into mornings filled with empty bottles, hazy memories, and the constant hum of paranoia. The Eagles' tour schedule was relentless, and Walsh, instead of slowing down, leaned harder into the chaos. The band itself was no better. Glenn Frey and Don Henley ruled with iron hands, controlling not just the music, but the image, the direction, the destiny of the Eagles. Their ambition clashed with their bandmates' desires, and Walsh often found himself caught in the middle. He was both the clown who could break the tension and the scapegoat when things got out of control. But Walsh wasn't just comic relief. His guitar became the voice of the band's growing darkness. Listen closely to the solos on Hotel California, and you hear not just technical brilliance, but a man pouring his own fractured soul into every note. The world thought they were hearing a polished rock anthem. In reality, they were hearing Joe Walsh scream through 6 strings. The fractures within the band deepened. Feuds became public. Arguments turned violent. And what had once been harmony became dissonance. Money, drugs, and pride poisoned every interaction. Yet, they couldn't stop. The machine was too big. The Eagles weren't just musicians anymore. They were an industry. And for Joe Walsh, the cost was personal. His addictions worsened, his relationships collapsed, and his sense of identity began to erode. Fame had given him everything he thought he wanted, but in truth, it was stealing everything he actually needed. The Eagles had reached the summit of rock and roll. But what do you do when the top of the mountain begins to crumble beneath your feet? Addiction has always haunted rock and roll like a shadow no spotlight could erase. For Joe Walsh, it wasn't just a side effect of fame, it became the very rhythm of his life. By the late 1970s, while the Eagles were shattering records, Walsh was shattering himself, piece by piece. Alcohol wasn't just a drink for him, it was a crutch, a companion, a shield. Then came the cocaine, promises of energy, euphoria, escape. Together, they built a prison disguised as a party. Walsh, with his sharp wit and infectious laugh, hid the truth well. On stage, he was electric. Off stage, he was often a ghost. Stories circulated about his excesses, trashed hotel rooms, nights lost to oblivion, days that disappeared into the haze of intoxication. Walsh himself would later admit he didn't just flirt with self-destruction, he married it. "I did everything wrong," he would confess years later. But at the time, wrong felt right, and right felt unattainable. The band didn't help. The Eagles' culture was already soaked in drugs and alcohol. Tour buses were mobile carnivals of chaos. Studios were sanctuaries for substances. It wasn't unusual for entire recording sessions to vanish in a blur of intoxication. Walsh, already predisposed to extremity, dove headfirst into it. But his demons weren't just about excess. They were about escape. Childhood wounds, pressures of fame, the growing fractures within the band, all of it demanded an outlet. And addiction offered an easy, if deadly, answer. He became a man who lived by the motto, "If you're going to crash, crash spectacularly." Yet even in his darkest hours, there was music. Walsh's riffs grew rawer, his solos more desperate, almost as though his guitar was the only tether keeping him from disappearing completely. It was paradoxical. The worse his personal life became, the more powerful his musical contributions sounded. His pain became the Eagles' edge, the jagged scar running across their otherwise polished harmonies. But addiction doesn't stop. It consumes. Walsh's health declined, his relationships crumbled, and whispers began that his days were numbered. He wasn't the only eagle lost in the fog, but his spiral was the most visible. His jokes about destruction were no longer funny. They were warnings. Behind the walls of arenas filled with adoring fans, Joe Walsh was quietly dying. And the worst part? He didn't care. If drugs and alcohol were the gasoline fueling the Eagles' chaos, then ego was the spark that set everything ablaze. Glenn Frey and Don Henley ran the band with a vision so sharp, it often cut their own members. They wanted control, perfection, dominance, and they usually got it. But that left little room for collaboration, or for the fragile bonds of friendship to survive. For Joe Walsh, the feuds were constant and brutal. He was the band's clown, its lightning rod, its unpredictable wild card. Sometimes, that made him beloved. Other times, it made him expendable. He clashed with Frey's discipline and Henley's exacting standards. Walsh lived for the moment, while they lived for the legacy. The collision was inevitable. The backstage environment was a minefield. Arguments erupted over set lists, over money, over songwriting credits. Even the smallest disagreements grew into towering conflicts, often fueled by substances and sleepless nights. Bandmates who once stood shoulder to shoulder now stood with clenched fists, both metaphorically and literally. There's one infamous night that sums it up best: the long night at Wrong Beach. During a benefit concert, tempers boiled over between Glenn Frey and Don Felder. Threats were exchanged on stage, microphones hot in front of a stunned audience. Walsh, caught in the middle, tried to diffuse the tension, but he was powerless against the tidal wave of rage that had been building for years. These weren't just professional disputes, they were personal betrayals. Friendships that had once blossomed under the California sun now withered under the weight of greed, pride, and exhaustion. Each man believed he was indispensable, and each was determined to prove it, even if it destroyed the band. Walsh, despite his charm, found himself increasingly isolated. He had joined the Eagles to make music, to inject energy, to ride the wave, but now the wave was crashing, and he was trapped beneath it. The friendships he thought he'd forged were cracking, and no amount of humor could glue them back together. Backstage became a battlefield, and the casualties weren't just egos, they were bonds, brotherhood, and trust. The irony of the Eagles' rise was that their music grew more timeless, even as their band grew more toxic. Songs like Hotel California, Life in the Fast Lane, and New Kid in Town didn't just top charts, they became the soundtrack to an entire generation. They embodied freedom, rebellion, disillusionment, and the dreamlike glow of America in the 1970s. And at the heart of many of those songs was Joe Walsh. His guitar solos weren't just notes. They were confessions, primal screams, raw truths hidden beneath layers of melody. His fingerprints are all over the band's most iconic work, each riff an echo of his inner chaos. Life in the Fast Lane, for example, wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was Walsh's reality. He coined it during a high-speed drive, living the very words that would become an anthem. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was crafting music that warned against the very lifestyle he was drowning in. But the success came at a cost. Every record-breaking tour, every platinum album, every magazine cover only tightened the vice around the band's neck. They had to outdo themselves, again and again, no matter the personal toll. Sleep became a luxury, sobriety a joke, sanity a fading memory. For Walsh, the contradiction was devastating. He was both celebrated and condemned by the same machine. Fans adored his contributions, but his bandmates questioned his reliability. The spotlight made him a legend, but it also exposed his every flaw. And the harder he tried to keep up with the pace, the deeper he sank into addiction and despair. The Eagles weren't just making history, they were destroying themselves in the process. By the late 1970s, the band was a hollow shell of its former self, united only by the need to keep producing, keep touring, keep feeding the machine. Their music defined an era, but behind the harmonies, behind the soaring guitar lines, there was only fracture, bitterness, and exhaustion. And for Joe Walsh, the question loomed larger with each passing day. How much longer could he survive inside a band that was killing him? By 1980, the Eagles were no longer a band. They were a war zone. The fights backstage had spilled into the public eye. The addictions had grown too loud to ignore, and the weight of their fame had turned the dream into a nightmare. It wasn't one fight or one scandal that broke them. It was death by 1,000 cuts. And by the time the last note rang out on their final tour, the wounds were too deep to heal. For Joe Walsh, the breakup was both inevitable and devastating. He had walked into the band at their peak and lived through their descent. In interviews, he would later describe those final years as a slow unraveling, a band bound together not by love of music, but by contracts and obligations. The Long Run, their final studio album of that era, was almost a prophecy in itself. It was indeed a long, painful run toward collapse. When the Eagles officially disbanded, it wasn't a quiet fade-out. It was acrimonious, messy, bitter. Glenn Frey and Don Henley went on to launch successful solo careers. Timothy B. Schmidt and Don Felder tried to carve their own paths. And Walsh? He continued as he always had, through the chaos, into the fog of addiction, with his guitar as both weapon and wound. But here's the irony. Even as the band members went their separate ways, the world refused to let the Eagles die. Their records continued to sell in staggering numbers. Their greatest hits compilation became one of the best-selling albums of all time, outselling even Michael Jackson's Thriller in certain years. The fans didn't care about the feuds or the addictions. They just wanted the music. And so, whispers of a reunion began. At first, they seemed impossible. The wounds were raw, the egos still inflamed. Don Henley even quipped that the Eagles would get back together when hell freezes over. But as time passed, the lure of unfinished business and the staggering financial incentive proved too strong to ignore. In 1994, hell froze over. The Eagles reunited for the aptly titled Hell Freezes Over Tour. It was triumphant, nostalgic, and lucrative beyond measure. But beneath the surface, the resentments still simmered. Walsh, now older and somewhat wiser, tried to keep his footing, but the same power struggles remained. It was less about brotherhood and more about business. The long goodbye wasn't just a phrase, it was their reality. Breakups, reunions, lawsuits, reconciliations. The cycle repeated itself like a curse. Each reunion brought joy to fans, and pain to the men who had to relive old battles. And through it all, Joe Walsh played on, carrying both the pride of being part of history and the scars of having survived it. The Eagles could never quite let each other go, but neither could they fully forgive. To the public, Joe Walsh was the clown prince of the Eagles, the joker, the comedian, the lovable rogue. He cracked jokes in interviews, played the fool on stage, and leaned into the persona of the wild man who didn't take life too seriously. But behind that smile was a man unraveling. Addiction wasn't his only demon. Walsh struggled with crippling self-doubt, anxiety, and the feeling that he didn't quite belong. Even at the height of fame, he carried the scars of childhood insecurities. He often described feeling like an outsider in the Eagles, the guy who joined late, who brought chaos into their order. His humor masked his pain, but it couldn't erase it. During the 1980s, his solo career sputtered. While Henley and Frey scored chart-topping hits, Walsh drifted, releasing albums that never reached the same heights. The pressure to prove himself grew heavier, and his addictions deepened. Cocaine and alcohol weren't luxuries anymore. They were lifelines. They silenced the doubts, at least temporarily. But each high was followed by a lower low, until Walsh was caught in a cycle he couldn't escape. Friends began to worry. His health deteriorated, his finances spiraled, and his reputation, once larger than life, became a cautionary tale. There were whispers that he might not survive the decade, and Walsh himself admitted he didn't care much if he did. The smile, the humor, the antics, they were camouflage for a man who was, in truth, drowning. But there was another side to Joe Walsh, a quieter one, rarely seen by fans. He had a deep love for his family, especially his daughter Emma, who became a catalyst for change. In interviews years later, he confessed that he looked at her and realized he couldn't keep living the way he had. He didn't want her to grow up with a memory of a father who had destroyed himself. This realization planted the seed for recovery. But the road ahead was long, uneven, and fraught with relapses. For years, Walsh lived a double life, the entertainer with the smile and the addict hiding in the shadows. He had fame, fortune, and legacy, but he lacked peace. Only later, when sobriety finally took root, would Walsh admit the truth. The smile was never enough. Behind the music, behind the reunions, there were secrets fans never saw, dark chapters that haunted the Eagles' history. Walsh, at 77, has finally begun to open up about them, revealing just how deep the fractures went. One of the darkest truths was the sheer brutality of the band's internal battles. Glenn Frey and Don Felder's feud wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was open warfare. Walsh recalls nights when the tension was so thick, he thought the band might explode mid-concert. Fists were clenched, threats were whispered, and the music was the only glue holding it together. Then there were the excesses. Walsh has spoken candidly about the staggering amounts of drugs consumed, the hotel rooms destroyed, the lives nearly lost. He described it as a carnival of self-destruction, one that fans never glimpsed from their seats. "We were a mess," he admitted. "The fact that we made it out alive is a miracle." But perhaps the darkest shadow was the way the band's success devoured their humanity. They weren't friends anymore. They were business partners trapped in a machine too big to escape. Every decision was about money, about image, about maintaining the empire. And as Walsh has revealed, the toll was devastating. Marriages collapsed. Friendships evaporated. Souls grew weary. The band's darkest days weren't just about addiction or feuds. They were about the loss of innocence. The Eagles had begun as dreamers, singing about freedom, love, and the open road. By the end, they were prisoners of their own success, chained to expectations they could no longer meet. For Walsh, these memories remain raw. At 77, he doesn't sugarcoat them. He calls it what it was: survival. "We weren't living. We were just trying to get through each day without killing each other or ourselves," he confesses. And yet, through all the darkness, the music endured. Fans never stopped listening. The songs outlived the chaos, even if the men who made them were nearly destroyed by it. Today, Joe Walsh stands as a survivor. At 77, his hair grayer, his body slower, but his spirit sharper than ever. He looks back not with regret, but with clarity. Sobriety gave him a second life, one he never expected. And with that clarity comes truth. The truth he has begun to share about his time with the Eagles. He admits the addictions, the chaos, the broken friendships. He doesn't hide behind the old jokes anymore. Instead, he speaks openly, almost as a warning to younger musicians. "I lived the fast lane," he says, "and it nearly killed me." But Walsh also acknowledges the magic. For all the darkness, the music they made changed the world. He looks back at Hotel California, at the endless tours, at the nights when everything clicked, and he admits there was beauty in the madness. He knows fans don't want to hear only the scandals. They want to remember the music that shaped their lives, and he's proud to have been a part of it. At 77, Walsh speaks with gratitude. He thanks his bandmates, even the ones he fought with. He thanks the fans who never abandoned the Eagles. Most of all, he thanks sobriety for giving him a chance to live long enough to tell the story. The Eagles' saga is one of triumph and tragedy, harmony and dissonance, dreams and disillusionment. And Joe Walsh, the wild child who once threatened to burn out before 40, has become its living witness. As he says today, "We weren't perfect, far from it, but we were real." And that's what the music still is, real. And with those words, the curtain finally closes, not on the myth, but on the man who lived it. Joe Walsh's confessions peel back the shine of the Eagles and reveal the scars beneath. His story is one of survival, truth, and the cost of greatness. What do you think? Does the music outweigh the chaos? Subscribe, comment, and join the conversation. The legend may be over, but the questions remain.